Thank you very much for joining our interview series, Professor Rodrigo. Let me start right away with the first question. In the light of Rodrigo Duterte's ICC detention and Sara Duterte's impeachment trial, how do you interpret the Duterte family's electoral resurgence as a recalibration of populist performativity rather than a simple continuation of its earlier iteration?
Right. Okay. Well, thanks very much to the ECPS for this kind invitation. So your first question really is a hard question already. Um, so just to be clear, just to be clear to your audience, I'm not a political scientist. Yes, I'm not a legal expert. My area really is in media and democracy. So I'm particularly focused on news media, independent journalism in the Philippines, and I'm trying to expand that to Southeast Asian countries as well, but very much interested in media populism. And I think this is one of the main thrusts of the ECPS. So maybe before I go into details, I think it would help if I provide some very brief backgrounder about the Philippine midterm elections. So we have just recently concluded the midterm elections in the Philippines. So normally the midterm elections are less enticing compared to the national ones. Why? Because it is usually a referendum or a test of the trust or approval ratings of the current president or the current administration as a whole. This midterm elections that we just had is relatively more colorful and perhaps some would say more historic compared to past election cycles because the strong support for the current administration did not stand still. So I think my key takeaway for this election is that at least if we look at the national results of the Senate race results, the midterm elections results are somewhat bad for President Marcos, but at the same time, it's also not so good for Vice President Sara Duterte, who is currently and who will eventually face an impeachment trial at the Senate. So that's my main takeaway. So regarding your question, there is obviously a resurgence of support for the Dutertes. So if we look at both at the national and the regional local levels, you can see some clear indications that there is indeed a resurgence of support for the former President Rodrigo Duterte, who is currently detained at the Hague, at the International Criminal Court for charges of crimes against humanity. But also to the political clan of the Dutertes in general. So the former President Duterte won the mayoralty race very easily. And also his children have won virtually all important key positions in the city of Davao. So if the question is there a resurgence? The short answer is yes. Is there a recalibration of expressions of support for the Dutertes? There were clear recalibrations, but there are also some emerging, more complicated mix of expressions of support for the Dutertes.
Right.
Yeah.
Does the Duterte camp's sustained support reflect what you have elsewhere called the symbolic resilience of populist narratives, particularly in the context where legal accountability coexists with popular legitimacy?
Well, it appears they can. It appears they can sustain this support from the city, from the regional publics, regional voters. but also there are clear indications that this public support can be cut down, can be trimmed down. So again, if we look at the national Senate race in the previous midterm elections, um, not there is no clear and concise support going to the Dutertes, because these midterm elections also opened opportunities for non-Dutertes, or anti-Dutertes rather, for supporters of the liberal opposition, for example, which paved the way for the former senators Aquino and Pangilinan to win this election cycle. So yeah, the support can be sustained, especially in the local level, but in the national or even regional levels, there might be some strong opposition and consistent opposition as well to the Dutertes.
Right. To what extent does the Duterte revival indicate the adaptive strength of populist movements to institutional rupture and legal contestation? Can this be read as a post-accountability phase in the Philippine populism?
Oh, definitely. The resurgence, for example, of so-called young or youth voters. Many of them, well, we have no concrete data yet, but it appears that many observers share a consensus that the young votes, or the youth vote rather, delivered not only for the not for the Dutertes nor the Marcoses, but more on candidates, independent candidates that spoke well of important platforms of governance. For example, agriculture, local livelihood, basic education, and so on. So yes, the short answer to your question is yes as well.
Right. Considering the dynastic entrenchment of both the Dutertes and Marcoses, how does Philippine populism mediate between elite familial power and its rhetorical positioning as an anti-elite, anti-establishment politics?
Right. I'm not an expert in that field. I understand we have a couple of scholars and political scientists working on the familial and patronage politics, for example. But what I can say in response to your question is the anti-establishment expressions are still very much predominant, not only in the national level, but I would argue that more clearly in the local and regional levels. Because in the regional and local levels, for example, the race for the House of Representatives, this is the lower house of Congress, quote unquote, lower house of Congress, um, and even the race for governorship. Yeah. So there are a lot of anti-establishment and anti-elite sentiments going on in this environments, and not so surprisingly, you can see the same members of same political families who use the very same expressions of anti-elitism and anti-establishment. So it's a bit toxic, in other words, to see how anti-elitism and anti-elite sentiments uh, play fair in regional and local elections. Yeah.
Right. How does the personalization of governance, exemplified by Sara Duterte's political rhetoric and Rodrigo Duterte's mayoral campaign from detention, reinforce the mythos of populist indispensability in Philippine political culture?
Right. I think the indispensability aspect of your question has to do with the durable brand of politics, and populism in particular, in its right wing or authoritarian populism, as I would be more suggestive of. There is a sense of durability because, well, in the first place, the Dutertes have been in political power in the city of Davao for what? For over 2 decades now. So this style, this mediated style in particular of authoritarian populist sentiments really helped them to stay in power. And of course, as you mentioned earlier, there are many institutional aspects, institutional barriers as well that help them stay in power. So political patronage is one of them. Um, um, the virtues of, not the virtues, but the collaboration between and among political clans in the local politics have really helped sustain their durable brand of politics in the city of Davao. Yeah.
Right. Is the current Marcos Duterte schism a rupture within populist logic itself, or does it signal a competition over the same populist register of strongman sovereignty and political vengeance?
Well, I wouldn't call it really a schism or a rupture in the context of populist politics because, in the first place, it's a bit challenging to identify President Marcos as a populist. Of course, he has some expressions that would resonate or that would qualify as a populist expression, say, of being pro-people. But compared with the brand of populism espoused by the former President Rodrigo Duterte, this is not really a schism between populist politics, but really it's about politics at large. So, for example, as you may know, both current President Marcos and Vice President Sara Duterte ran on a so-called platform of unity during the 2022 national elections. But it only took them, what, a year or so, or even less, to realize that there was indeed no unity at all in the brand of politics that they tried to project. So populism may not be at the forefront in the schism or in the rupture between the Marcoses and the Dutertes. But definitely, if we look at populism, say, as an expression of how you want to resonate with the people, many segments of the publics, that's where you can see a lot of potential in the use or misuse of populist brand of politics. Yeah.
Right. In your analysis of editorial framing and mediatized nationalism, how has the news media contributed to either normalizing or contesting the discursive legitimacy of the Duterte camp's post-presidency populism?
It's a mixed bag. I haven't expanded yet my study of editorials, but what I can say in relation to the previous midterm election cycle is that I think there are independent news media outlets that have done a great job of reporting in this election cycle. So, for example, if you look at the reporting of Rappler, so Rappler is an online media platform, a news media outlet. They expanded their reporting from national to even regional and local levels. And the coverage of the regional and local levels really is something that has been uh, consistently challenging, not only for national news media outlets, but even for the local ones, because, well, you lack sufficient number of manpower to cover this election results or election race in the local levels in the provinces, for example. But this time around, I can I think it's commendable to look at how news media outlets, for example, collaborated with campus journalists, regional campus journalists, for example, who covered important local elections in their respective regions and provinces.
Right. How would you assess the role of algorithmic propaganda networks, particularly on platforms like Facebook, in sustaining the Duterte narrative as a populist moral crusade amid institutional delegitimization?
I haven't looked systematically yet on the social media part of this midterm election, but um, I would surmise, and based on my very cursory reading of Facebook pages or Facebook posts, for example, of politicians, um, social media platforms, especially Facebook in the Philippines, really is relatively the more toxic um, political environment that you can think of. What do I mean by this is the place where you can see a lot of politicians, national and local ones, trying to create or reinforce certain images that would resonate with their target publics. So, for example, what makes this environment more toxic is that, well, you see a senatorial candidate, for example, who would rather dance and use his show business celebrity charisma on stage rather than talk about his platform of governance. So, this is one aspect that makes social media campaigning more toxic. Of course, I do not deny the fact that the social media platforms are also potential avenues for grievances and for credible sentiments that the voters, especially the young ones, can use to express their discontent, for example, against the administration or any politicians for that matter.
Right. Has political journalism in the Philippines evolved into a form of discursive battleground where journalists are not just observers, but are increasingly cast as either custodians or co conspirators within populist frameworks?
Right. I think political journalism in the country has been in that state for the long time. A quick backgrounder. So the Philippine press, Philippine journalism, as in general. So this is the Philippine journalism environment is regarded to be what one of the freest, or if not the freest, practice of independent journalism in the region. Of course, there's a lot of important and historical experiences by Filipino journalists that made them uh, who or what they practice today. And so, going back to your question, yeah, political journalism has been, for the longest time, a discursive battleground for the expression of a variety of political sentiments. So you have journalists um, who may support certain kinds of populist sentiments expressed by the Dutertes. But at the same time, you have journalists who are openly critical of this authoritarian populist sentiments of the leader. And then, of course, you also have some journalists, even some news media outlets that are not so keen in expressing their political stance. Perhaps they prefer to observe, um, say, objectivity or non-partisanship in the way they conduct their journalistic practices. So, yeah.
Right. Drawing from your work on media law and judiciary, how do you evaluate the potential of institutions like the Senate and the Supreme Court to act as bulwarks against populist legalism, or are they being absorbed into its logics?
Well, I'd like to believe that, or I'd like to have a confidence in institutional balances or institutions of checks and balances rather. So, for example, my work on the Supreme Court and press freedom in the country. So I think there are some avenues, some good potential for the Supreme Court to police and regulate extreme incivility coming from politicians and even from government officials. In the case of the news media, well, that's what I mentioned a while ago, the potential of the news media and independent journalism in particular to express their discontent and even challenge illiberal politics and authoritarian populist sentiments. But
Right.
I would even go as far as looking at the potential of other institutions. So, for example, the potential of the academe, of universities, and even credible polling firms or survey firms that we have. These are critical institutions, these are critical organizations that can help build a more diverse and more democratic environment. Yeah.
Right. Is Sara Duterte's impeachment trial a moment of institutional accountability or a spectacle of juridico-political theater shaped by dynastic rivalry? Given your analysis of politicization of libel law, to what extent are legal instruments still being weaponized to manufacture legitimacy in Duterte Marcos power struggle?
Well, I think there are two main questions there. One has to do with the impeachment trial of the current vice president. This is definitely an expression of accountability. And one thing that we need to look at here is the upcoming impeachment trial of the vice president at the Senate. So this will take in, I think the schedule is sometime in July, last week of July. So this will be live broadcast. The impeachment trial of the vice president will be live broadcast. So what this means is that the sentiments of the public will figure significantly in the way the senators, the sitting senator jurors, will decide on the trial of the vice president. So yeah, so that's the one thing. And then the other one, your question has to do with the institutions as well. Yeah. So yeah, there are, I understand there are related cases, related libel accusations, not only against the Marcoses and the Dutertes, but also against other politicians that is interestingly to that we need to look, we need to keep an eye on. And fortunately, I would say there were recent trends. There were recent initiatives by the Supreme Court to be serious about how exactly do we treat libel, and is there a room for the criminalization or decriminalization of libel as a criminal offense? Because in the Philippines, libel is a criminal offense. So I think we're only the only country, or I think the only one of the two countries in the world that impose libel as a criminal offense. So that's one thing to keep an eye on. Yeah.
All right. With the electoral success of figures outside the dynastic duopoly, such as Bam Aquino and Francis Pangilinan, do you perceive a nascent re-articulation of democratic pluralism, perhaps even a counter-populist discourse emerging from below?
I'd like to believe that way. I'd like to think that there is really a great potential for the liberal opposition to challenge the uh, toxic brand of authoritarian populism. But at the same time, there are some unfortunate realities. So, for example, if you look at the upcoming composition of the Senate, so we have 24 senators in the Senate, and a third of them, so we're talking about 8 members of them, are related to one another. So we have 4 duo siblings or 4 pairs of senators who are siblings. So this is really a kind of toxic politics that we really need to be critical about. So your question about political dynasty, for example. So this, I hope, is one thing that can be tackled seriously by the resurging liberal opposition in this election cycle. Yeah.
Right. What civic, educational, or legal interventions do you view as most urgent to disrupt the entrenched narrative of authoritarian masculinity and political exceptionalism in Philippine populist politics?
Right, that's an important question because we have a lot of discussion in the Philippines and even in Southeast Asia on how to combat mis and disinformation. So I think that is critical to both political education and even civic education. How or to what extent can media literacy um, develop our astute understanding of what a credible political brand or what a credible political electoral campaigning slogan really matters. Yeah.
And finally, Jeff, in your view, does the 2025 midterm outcome represent a deepening of the populist authoritarian paradigm, or does it contain seeds of democratic recalibration amidst an increasingly mediatized and dynastically polarized landscape?
Well, the short answer is yes to both your questions. One is I think populism is here to stay. So again, I understand there's a lot of scholarly and public discussion about what really is populism. So I understand in your case, in many European and even in American brands of populism, so we are particular about right-wing populism or left-wing populism or illiberal populism. So in the Philippines, although those brands of populism figure, I think there are some historically and politically distinct brands of populism that we need to be more attentive as well. Um, but having said that, to answer your question, populism in the Philippines is here to stay. So whether we're dealing with a right wing or an illiberal or a left wing oriented kind of populism, it is here to stay because I think there is always this clamor for pro people and anti elite sentiments that will play fair in the landscape of national and even local politics. Yeah.
Jeff, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.